So recently I was told that I need to start doing more weird flex materials. And so I thought that not only would I do it, but I'll take you along in how to create one yourself. So the first thing you're going to want to do is, like always, come up here and create a new graph template. And we've already created a template in a tutorial that I'll link in the description below. So you can use the exact same one that I'm using here. And then once you've set up your graph in your project, you can just right click and hold this guy here and drop him in there so that we're going to be able to see what's going on just by plugging everything into our base here. And then I also want to come up into our materials, default, and edit. And I'm going to come over to the scale and just bring that all the way up. So we're going to be able to see our height information on our material. So it's actually going to pop using parallax occlusion to show us what our displacement map or height map is going to do. So first things first, I'm going to come in and I'm going to create a shape node. And this is going to be essentially the driving force for the shape of our entire cracker here. And so I'm going to plug this guy into our histogram range and our normal. And nothing's going to show up, and that's because our entire texture map here is white. But if we go into our shape and we bring the scale down to something like 0.85, now we're going to have our nodes start to show up. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add some warping kind of just along the edges here, because I want to get some of those ripples along the sides. So I'm going to bring this guy back and add a warp node here. And then I'm going to add a Gaussian noise. And we're going to use this to kind of distort the sides a little bit. So if I just bring this guy in here into our input, and we take a look and see what it's doing, that's a little bit too distorted. So I just want to bring the intensity on that guy down to about 0.1. And you can see what it's going to do is just add a little bit of waviness to our initial form here. And again, we can come into our Gaussian noise, play around with the disorder, can play around with the scale for larger or smaller iterations of it. Can even do something like 28. I'm going to stick around 30. I think it's a pretty good size for what our object is going to be. And so from there, I want to go ahead and I want to add some, a little bit of a gradient along these edges here, because right now it's too sharp. It's pretty much completely black, completely white with very, very small gradient lines. So I just want to extend that a little bit to give it more of a rounded fall off. And so I'm going to add a bevel node. I'm just going to shift click to steal this guy and plug it in there. And you can see immediately it's going to pretty much extend it towards the edge of our texture map here. So we're going to get pretty much the cracker just falling off towards the end of our texture here. But I don't want that. I want to have a little bit of a black gap like we had in this texture here, so that we can isolate these crackers, the actual island of the cracker itself. So I'm going to come back into our bevel, and I'm going to take our distance and I'm going to decrease that all the way down and actually bring it into the negatives, so the bevel starts to eat away from our initial shape here, as opposed to adding a gradient on the outside. And so I think the gradient that I used was negative 0.11. Again, you can use really any number you want. I just found that this got the effect that I wanted. And then I can bring my smoothing all the way up to 5, and you can see that it's going to just kind of help me round out those corners a little bit. However, with the bevel, I found that it's a little bit too, again, straight of a fall off, and I want to have a little bit more of a rounded edge to it. So after that bevel, I'm going to put a curve node, and this is going to allow me to play around with these bevels here. If I take a look up here and I come down into my curve editor, if I just double click kind of in the middle there, you can see that I'm actually playing around with the curve itself for the gradient. And so I just want to kind of have a more rounded fall off. So I'm going to bring this guy up. Maybe pull these out a little bit so it's a little bit rounded. And you can see now that instead of, we bring this guy back here, instead of having just a kind of a sharp angular fall off, we're going to get this more rounded fall off. And that's just going to look a lot nicer, and it's going to help us pop our cracker kind of right out of the flat background. So that's looking pretty sick. I now want to add a little bit more ridges to my sides here to kind of give it that like stamped or pressed look that crackers have. And so I'm going to, off on the side here, I'm going to create a stripes node. And so what we're going to do with this is we're going to basically set up a distortion, and then we're going to distort our initial shape here along the edges. And you'll see that'll make sense in just a second here as I go ahead and create it. But first I'm going to click into our stripes, and I'm going to go up to, we'll make sure we visualize it. I'm going to go into 20 stripes. So we're just going to double the initial default value. And then I'm also going to bring the shift all the way down to 0 so that it's going left to right. And then I really want to bring the width down as well. And I'm going to bring the width down to about 0.42, I think I found for my initial material, my test. I think that worked the best. So I'm going to add a blur, high quality grayscale onto this, just to make sure that we get nice gradient, because you can see again that we've got a very sharp contrast, and that's not going to look very good with a distort or a warp node. So if we come into here, and I'm going to bring the intensity way down to something like 4, so you can start to see the gradient, and then obviously bringing the quality up to 1 just to ensure that we're getting the best quality out of this blur. And so this is going to allow us to essentially use as a gradient input for our warp. But the first or the last thing I guess I want to do is I just want to bring this through a curve, because I want to make these pop again. So we're going to do the exact same thing that we did for this curve up here. And I'm just going to bring that guy up, rounding it out a little bit so that we get the kind of the full breadth of the black to white range. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a directional warp. And then I'm going to take this guy, this curve here, and plug that in. And you can see immediately it's going to give us kind of that like, on the one side, kind of that nice loop, and here's a little bit more of a hook. And so I want to bring the intensity down to just 1.5. And so it's going to give us a different effect on each side. And so the way that I corrected that was that I just used a mirror grayscale node, just so that we can mirror them across the x-axis here. And then we can start playing around with the different amount of stripes. If you want more detail, you can have less, larger detail. You can play around with the curves as well. And then you can also play around with the intensity. And so now the last thing I want to do with this is I just want to add a levels node on towards the end of it. And I just want to go in and I want to bring our white output down a little bit. And I don't have a set numerical value that I want to bring it down. I just want to make sure that we don't have a pure white in the center there, because we want to go ahead and later down our pipeline add a little bit more of height effects that are going to surpass kind of our initial base level. And so if we have a pure white already going into that, we're not going to get the effect that we want. And instead we're going to have our material peaking and going flat in a lot of areas that we're going to want more curved and rounded height. All right, and so now we've created the initial shape that we want to go ahead and start using for the rest of our height map here, but I want to go ahead and I want to just add one more thing. So I'm going to add a histogram scan. I'm going to plug our levels into that guy. And I'm going to bring the position all the way up, bring the contrast all the way up to make sure that we have just a pure black and white. And I just want to use this as our kind of mask because we're going to use it a little bit later on for different areas of our pipeline. And I want to just use it as a separate offshoot of our initial shape to just use as a mask for those areas. So I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to put it up here, and I'm actually going to bring everything back a little bit so we have some more room. And so now working off of our levels here, I want to go ahead and I want to add a blend node. And I'm going to plug the blend into our background here and plug this guy in. Now I want to make sure that our mask is still connected to our levels there. And so this is going to be our blend between the next area that we're kind of shifting into being the kind of recessed area that you find around the holes of the cracker. And we're going to create those shapes and then blend them back in to our chain here. So for right now, I'm just going to put this as subtract so that we can still see what our shape is. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a tile generator. And I'm going to come into our tile generator here. And on the X amount, I only want to have 2. And then on the Y amount, we're going to do 5. And then we come into the pattern here. I want to make sure that I set this to paraboloid because we're going to use this as kind of like various air pockets and kind of indentations in our material. So I want them to be a lot smoother than we would get with bricks. And as I make our way down, I want to make sure that I set the scale to 2. And then the scale random also, I can set to 0.5. Now you're not going to see anything right now because the blending mode that these are using is additive. So if we scroll all the way down, you can see that we're using add. And I just want to change that to max. And so now we're going to be able to see the intersections of all of these paraboloids. Oh, and I accidentally changed it back. So as I scroll back up here, I also want to make sure that the offset is set to 0.5, and that's going to help stagger them because you'll see once we start creating the holes are actually going to be staggered to 3, 2, and 3. And so they're going to be a little bit offset, and this is going to help us just almost imitate or mimic that same pattern. And I also just want to come up and find our interstice X. And I also just want to bring that guy up as well to around 0.5. And so this is just going to have kind of almost like a buttressed leather or a tuft leather kind of deal. And we're going to use this again. You can kind of see where our holes in the cracker are going to be is these areas that we're going to essentially subtract from our initial geometry. And so the next thing I want to do is add a transformation 2D, and this is just going to help us tighten everything up a little bit. And so the numeric values for this one is a little bit more important or crucial, I'll say, just because it's going to help us line everything up a little bit nicer. And so for the width of our transformation, I used 60%. And on the height, I used 75%. And that's just going to help kind of squish things in a little bit. Next, I wanted to warp everything. And again, using a Gaussian node. Plugging that guy in. And that's a little bit too intense. And so I'm going to change the intensity just through the scale of our Gaussian noise. And I'm going to change this down to 8. And again, you can play around with the disorder again to get different variations in your pockets here. And I'm going to push this back a little bit. The next thing I want to do is I want to blur this because this is still a little bit too contrasted. And you can see that if I plug this guy in here, we're going to get a little bit too sharp points of intersection. So I just want to blur that out a little bit. And so I'm going to use an intensity of 16, quality of 1. And this is going to help us get the initial smoothness down. And I'm noticing that my map still looks a little bit flat. And so I'm going to come back down to our histogram range. Just bump up that range to 1 so that we can see the full color of our, the full range, I should say, of our height map here. And so now that we've finished the recessed areas, I want to go ahead and start creating the holes that we're going to actually put in these areas. And so we're actually going to steal these two guys right here. So I'm going to Control D that, because we're going to want to have the same offset and the same location as we had for these pockets. So I'm going to select our tile generator here, and I'm going to leave the amount, and I'm going to scroll down to where we have our scale, and the scale is going to be, I found 0.125 to be a good size, and they're very, very small. And we can leave the offset because it's in the right position. And everything else looks good. And you can see again too, as we scale all of this down, I want to come in and I want to add a blur high quality grayscale again, just to smooth it out a little bit. And I'm going to put this at an intensity of 4. And I'm going to add a blend. And I'm going to plug in our blur high quality grayscale. And I'm going to go to subtract because I want to subtract these values from here. And so now you can see kind of the effect that we want to get is where we're going to have all of our holes kind of in the areas that are a little bit pressed down. And so I'm starting to see that it's maybe a little bit too jagged still. So I might bring that intensity up to something like 20. And then we can also play around with the intensity of this blur as well. Say something like 3. Just to make it a little bit sharper, but still a little bit rounded. And so we've created the recesses and the holes, and now I want to go ahead and start creating kind of the air pockets that we can float around our material here. And then we can procedurally just disorder them and pretty much just generate new bumps in various areas. So I'm going to create a tile sampler node. And in this node here, the first thing I'm going to do is switch our pattern to paraboloid again. And I'm going to bring our X and our Y amount all the way down to 3. And we're going to go 3 by 3. And I want to make sure that our scale is set to 1. And I'm going to bring our scale random up to something like 0.7. So we get a little bit of difference in sizes. And as I come down here as well, we can play around with the position random, as well as a little bit of the offset. So I put the offset at 0.1. And again, you could put these at kind of whatever you want to put them at, because it's going to just be basically random air pockets across our material. So I'm going to put this at 2. I'm also going to color random. And you can see that as I do that, it pretty much colors most of them the same thing. And I want to go ahead and I just want to change our parameterization mode to scale. And so now it should do it based on the scale. Now, a lot of them are relatively the same size. And so I'm just going to do 0.15. And I don't like how that's kind of clipping through, so I'm going to just come back up, change the position random a little bit, maybe the offset. Nope, the offset's not going to work. Cool. So just come up here and maybe switch that to 4. And so now I want to go ahead. I want to add a little bit of warp to this. And again, using a Gaussian noise, plugging that in. I'm going to leave the intensity at 1, but I'm going to bring the scale right down to something like 14. And again, you can see that as we play around with the distorter, it's going to give us a lot of different bending and warping. You can also change the scale, play around with the amount of noise that you're getting. And then I want to go ahead and blur these again. Just leaving it on 10 for now, and we can see what that's going to look like in a second here. And now I want to start to merge this with our pipeline here. So I'm going to add a blend. I'm going to plug this guy in over top. And you can see kind of the air pockets that we're going to get initially, but I want to change our blend mode to be screen. So it's going to remove any of the, you can see, darker areas of this and only keep kind of the lighter areas. And then I'm going to bring the opacity of that way down, because you can see that kind of looks a little malfangled. I'm going to bring that down to about 0.4. So that's going to give us an initial, not bad design. But I want to go ahead and I want to remove these excess areas that are kind of falling off outside of our cracker. And this is why we initially created the mask at the start. And you can see that by using this, we're going to be able to cut out all of that outside information that we don't want. So I'm going to take our guy here and plug this guy into the opacity. And you can see that we're going to get a little bit of an issue around the edges there. So all we have to do is take a blur high quality, bring this guy down. I'm going to bring the intensity right down. That doesn't look too bad. So now that we've created the geometry for our cracker, I want to go in and create the salt geometry that we're going to get across our entire mesh here. So I'm going to add a polygon 2 node. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tile it twice so that we're going to get 4 showing up. I'm going to just rotate it a little bit. Bring the number of sides down as well to 5. And then I'm going to come into our gradient, bring that way down so that we're getting a more flat surface there. And play around with the curve just a little bit. And these are going to be the initial geometry of our salt. And so what I'm going to do is add a blend. And I'm going to duplicate this polygon 2 because we're going to use it to kind of deconstruct or destroy our salt here a little bit. I'm going to plug this in. but make sure that our blending mode is on subtract. So now when I come back into this shape here, I want to make sure that our tiling is set to 1, and you can initially immediately see what it's going to do is just kind of cut away from our salt down here. I want to make sure my gradient's a little bit sharper. Play around with the curve. You bring the sides up. And then I'm going to add a transformation 2D node. And I'm just going to scale this down, making sure to visualize our blend here. And I'm just going to drag this around, again, scaling it how I see fit, to kind of just get weird, random patterns like that. And so when I find that, I'm going to add another blend. Just bring this over here. And I'm going to add a gradient linear 1. And what I want to do is I want to take these patterns here and I just want to apply this gradient over them so that they kind of have this angular gradients, like they're kind of sticking out of the surface at a more jagged direction. So I'm going to plug this guy in. And I'm going to change the blending mode down to multiply there. And you can see that because we have only the one gradient, it's going to essentially multiply over it entirely. And I want this to be kind of its own thing for each pattern. So I'm going to come into our gradient here and I'm going to tile it twice. Now, unfortunately, the way that it tiles it is it's going to tile it one in the center and then one cut off on the top and bottom. So to fix that, I want to do a transformation 2D here. And making sure we're visualizing this. I'm going to come into our transformation and I'm going to bring the Y up to 0.25. And you can see now that I've essentially just tiled it accurately across like you would basically intuitively believe it to do instead of doing, I don't really know why it does this, but anyways, that's the short fix for it. And now lastly, I want to add a curve onto this guy because I want to have some more control over our gradient here. So if I come into our curve, and again, play around with this a little, you can see that I can greatly increase the fall off of it. Add a little bit more of a peak and a little bit more of a fall off. And you can obviously make this a lot sharper if you want. I would not recommend it. And kind of something like that, where it just goes from a darker area to a more peaked area. Just going to add a little bit more variety to the overall shapes that we're creating. And so now that we've got our four kind of salt grains here, I'm going to go ahead and add a slope blur grayscale because I want to add a little bit of wear and tear to these. They're a little bit too sharp and a little bit too clean. So I'm going to add a fractal sum base to these guys. Again, bringing the samples way up, all the way to 32. I want to bring the intensity way down. I'm also going to switch to the min blending mode. And now when I come into our fractal sum base here, I'm going to just bring this max level way down. Bring our min level up to around 2 or 3. So now we can see what it's going to do for our salt here. Is it's just going to add a little bit more wear and tear to it. And the amount that you affect your min and max levels is going to pretty much help define these miniature divots and lacerations. So now that we've pretty much completed the overall geometry for our salt here, I want to go ahead and start isolating each one of these individually. So I'm going to add a transformation 2D node. I'm just going to bring this guy up. And I'm just going to control duplicate this guy so that we have 4 of them total. I'm just going to bring these guys up a little bit. And so for our top node here, I'm going to hold down Shift as I click and drag so that we keep it proportionate. And I'm just going to isolate this guy here. Same thing for the rest of these guys. Just Shift click, drag. And I want to make sure that I get these guys pretty much isolated by themselves, making sure there's no tiling going on. You can see this one's cutting off a little bit. And again, he's still cutting off a little tiny bit. So I'll make him a little bit smaller there. And that should be fine. All right, and so now that we've got these 4 isolated, I want to go ahead and I want to bring them through a shape splatter node. Let's see if I can spell it. There we go. So bring it through a shape splatter. And the first thing you'll notice that if I bring this guy in is that we only have 1 pattern slot. And so I need to come into the shape splatter and I need to bring our pattern input number up to 4. And you can see that it's going to add 3 more slots for us to just plug in all of these nodes. It's also going to allow us to plug in a background height. And so with that, I'm going to come back to where we just added the air pockets. And I'm going to plug that guy into our background height. So now you can see that we're going to get these salt pieces and they're going to kind of scatter or splatter, thus the name, around our height information. And it's going to kind of conform a little bit to the background information. You can see in the darker areas, the salt's actually going to take on a little bit of that color range, whereas the brighter areas is going to kind of come up towards the top. And this is why we wanted to initially decrease the white levels of our shape kind of towards the start of the tutorial, because we wanted to allow some room for ourselves to add this extra height information. So with that, I'm just going to shift and left click to steal this so we can see kind of what's going on here. So initially that's going to be really, really big. And so I want to come into our shape splatter here and we're going to play around with this a little bit. So right off the bat, I'm going to do about 75 and 75 because I want to get a lot of small salt information. Again, kind of just around our material. And I'm going to come up to my environment. I'm just going to change the exposure. I find it a little bit hard to see. And maybe 75 and 75 is a little too much, but let's try 60 and 60. And that should be cool. So I'm going to make my way down. And I'm going to change the scale random. And you can see as I scale random, it's going to randomly scale all of our salt here. And I don't want it to be so tiny. I might do 0.6. And I'm also going to come over to position random. And this is now going to kind of make it look a little bit more realistic. Having a bunch of salt just kind of thrown around our material here. We can also come down to the rotation and change the rotation random. And so here's one of the cooler areas I think about the shape splatter node, is that it's going to allow us to also conform a little bit to our background image. And you can see that, especially like in these holes here, if we take a look and go back to 0, you can see that it's just going to protrude from the surface. But as we conform it to the background, it's going to kind of take on a little bit more of the shape of the underlying geometry. And that's really cool. That's very powerful, actually, to allow us to get these shapes to kind of realistically interact with the surface that they're on. We can also play around with the smooth conform. You can see for certain areas, it's not going to be the most useful, and I'm actually going to probably just leave that off. We can also do skew from background slope. And again, that's going to just help sell the illusion that it's kind of skewing to fit on that surface again. So I'm going to bring this down to something like 0.2. And so now I might be finding that there's a little bit too, even though we've randomly positioned all of this, it might still be a little bit too uniform. So I'm going to come in and I want to mask off a lot of this salt. And I also want to come in here and I want to change the scale again. Maybe push it to something like 2. And then maybe bring the scale random up a little bit just to see what kind of effect we get. And that might be a little bit large still. So this one is just going to take a lot of fine tuning to kind of get the effect that you like, and the sizes of the salt chunks that you think look relatively good. I'm actually going to come in and do maybe 1.25. Again, coming down to play around with the masking. Just so that we get a lot of salt in the different areas, but I don't want it to be so just caked in salt. Maybe bring the conform back down to 0.5. So we get some more pop. We can also play around with the height offset as well to actually push them out of our geometry. You can see if I push that guy up to 1, it's just going to pretty much almost remove them a little bit from our material. So I don't want to do that. But I do want them to kind of look like they are their own separate entity a little bit. So I might do 0.05. Very, very subtle effects. That's starting to look cool. And so now the last thing that I want to do is I just want to make sure that we're not getting any salt information on the outsides. And you can't really see it too much on here, but you can definitely see it on our material, getting salt outside of the area where the cracker is. And so we actually have this mask random area. And I want to go ahead and I want to use the mask that we had used earlier on again, just by plugging that guy in. And as I come down to the masking portion of our shape splatter here, I just want to use our mask random map multiplier. And as I bring that up, you can see we're going to completely remove all of those salt information from the outside of our cracker. All right, and so we pretty much completed the basis of our geometry, or our height displacement map here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete our viewer, and I'm just going to plug in all of our nodes here. As well, I'm going to just plug in a few uniform color nodes. Just into our roughness and our albedo outputs here. And then when I have that done, I'm going to go ahead and right click on our graph and view outputs in 3D. And so we're pretty much going to get the same thing that we had. Now our height map's going to be a little bit nicer. It's going to be a little bit taller. And so we're going to see our information a little bit clearer. And I want to go ahead and create one last output. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to type in output. And in our output here, I'm going to come over to add item for usage. And under usage, I'm going to find opacity. We're going to use this as our opacity or our transparency to get rid of the areas that aren't our cracker material. So I'm just going to change the identifier to opacity, label to opacity, and I'm going to add it to the material group in case we want to use this later on for kind of like subgraph graphs. And so I'm just going to right click and view outputs in 3D. And you can see immediately that it's going to disappear. And we're going to lose everything. And that's because we don't have anything plugged into our opacity. And so it's just by default going to be black. So if I come over here and I find our mask again, and I take this guy, I can click it, there we go. And I bring this guy all the way back down to our opacity. You can see that we're only going to get this area of our mesh showing up. But I also want to make sure that our holes actually have some see-through ability, I guess we'll say. So I'm going to add a blend onto our mask into our opacity here. And I'm going to come back to where we've created our holes. And I'm going to take these guys and just plug them into the top of our blend. And I want to make sure that we subtract. And you can see now that we're going to get our holes showing up on our opacity. So it's going to be slightly transparent. So all we're going to have to do is I'm going to add a levels node. And as I bring in the whiteness of this levels, you can see that we're going to start to pretty much chip away from our holes until we get pretty much that. And that's not what we want. So I'm going to bring this out just a little bit, maybe bring the mid gray up just a little bit too, so that we don't have kind of a like pseudo invisible cracker. We want it to be either pretty much opaque or transparent. And so something like that's pretty cool. Actually might want to bring that black down a little bit, just so that we're getting that transparent bits in our cracker there. And that's looking pretty sweet. So I'm going to bring these guys over here down to our opacity. And that's awesome. I'm going to come back up and I want to start working on our base color or albedo here. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to take a gradient map and I'm going to plug in our height information before we added the salt to it. I'm just going to plug this guy in here. And then I'm just going to knock out this grayscale here. And I'm going to bring this guy in. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our height information as pretty much just an indicator towards what kind of colors we're going to work with here. So one suggestion that I'll have is to actually type in cracker saltine into your browser and just find an image that you like that actually has kind of the colors that you're looking for. So I'm going to go with this one right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our gradient editor here, and this little guy should pop up. And I just want to make sure that I click in here to get our colors. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to pick gradient. And you can see that as I do that, it's going to bring this little color picker up. And if I click and drag, you can see it's going to create a line. And it's going to give us a whole bunch of colors that we picked. So I'm going to do that with our image that we just looked up. And I'm going to go from kind of the lightest value to kind of the darkest value. And I just did that off screen there. And you can see what immediately we're going to get is kind of a lighter value. No, I don't really want that one. So I'm just going to get rid of it. And this is going to allow us to kind of play around, just kind of getting base colors. Get rid of that. We don't really need that guy. And so I want to just kind of give it a toasty look, right? Where the higher areas are a little bit toastier and the lower areas are a little bit still baked, but not as much time in the sun, we'll say. And that's actually pretty good. So I found that kind of working with around 3 colors of this variety is not too bad, and it actually makes it look somewhat decent. I want to take this guy and I want to just make it a little bit darker though. There we go. And 3 colors is actually relatively easy to work with, and it's a good way to get a base albedo going. So I'm happy with that. But now I want to add some of the salt color information into this over top. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a blend. And I'm going to use our shape splatter here to help mask off our salt pieces here. And the nice thing about a shape splatter is that if you use and displace your geometry using it, you can actually use a shape splatter to mask. And this is going to allow us to plug in our splatter data 1. And we're going to be able to mask off the pieces of salt. Now the problem initially is that we're only getting the first pattern that we plugged in. And so all we need to do is, you can see here, it says our pattern ID start range and our pattern ID end range. So our start range is on 1, so we're going to get pattern 1, but the end is also on 1, so we're only going to stop at 1. But I want to go from 1 to 4. So I'm just going to increase this up, and you can see that as I do, we're going to get all of the pieces of salt. And at 4, that's going to be the last information we have. So as I increase it past 4, we're not going to get anything new. We can also randomly mask out some of that, but I want to keep all of it because I want to keep all of the salt that we have. So with that selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to again bring our shape splatter to mask through a gradient, because we need to go from grayscale to color. If you see, if I plug this guy in, we're trying to blend grayscale with color and it's not going to work. So I just need to run it through a gradient map to colorize it. And so now when I do that, we're going to get all of our salt pieces showing up. And because we have a black and white, and I want to keep the white values, I'm going to switch my blending mode to screen. And so now this is going to allow us to highlight and showcase our salt pieces, but it's going to remove all of that black background. And now that's pretty much the effect I want, but it's a little bit too intense. So I'm going to take that opacity way down, kind of something like 0.25-ish, around there. And it's gonna be interesting because it's going to almost give it that transparent look to it, like we can actually see through it. As you can see, we kind of get some of the underlying color information. So it's going to give us that pseudo-transparent look, and that's going to be really good once we couple that with the roughness map. Now I also want to add a little bit more surface information, and so I'm going to add a fractal sum base. And I'm going to use this to kind of get just a little bit more pastry or surface cracks. And so I'm going to run it through a slope blur grayscale. And I'm going to run it through with itself. And as I increase the samples and decrease the intensity, you can kind of see that as I decrease the max level, we get kind of this little speckling effect. And I thought it looked pretty cool for our cracker here. So I'm going to go ahead and add another blend. And I'm going to plug this guy in as well over top. Again, we need to make sure that we're not plugging in a grayscale into a color node. So I need to add a gradient map. And we can see kind of the effect that it's going to have, and we can play around with it as well. Maybe changing the min levels. And actually, I liked it better back on 1 there. And so we're just going to kind of get this flaking effect all across it. And I'm going to come down to our blending mode and I'm going to do add subtract. And so initially it's going to be very, very gross, and I would definitely not eat this cracker or advise it. But I want to come back into our opacity and I'm going to crank this right down. And I just want to kind of bring it up until we start seeing some of the flakes, maybe around 0.3. Not too bad there. Just to play around with the blending mode. Is this going to do? Yeah, and so I'm going to go into min. Actually, I like min. So we get this nice tiny little surface information. So that's going to help it look kind of like it's a little bit baked, right? Take that as you will. And so we pretty much have completed what I wanted to for the albedo. So I want to go ahead and just move on to adding some of this surface information to my normal map here. So I bring our normals over. I want to go ahead and I'm going to add just a normal node. And I want to plug in this guy right here into it so that we're going to get some of this normal information, because I want to use and draw some of that albedo information into our normals. So I'm going to add a normal combine. If I can find it, there we go. And this is going to allow us to basically just overlay these two different normal maps on top of each other. And so we're going to get the normal from our cracker here, and we're going to get the normal from our little, whatever you want to call these. I've been calling them flakes. Make sure that we just get detail oriented, get the highest quality. And then I want to just bring the intensity down to something like 0.15 or something. So that might be a little too low. Let's do 0.6. Just again, so we're getting some of that surface information. That's looking pretty cool, actually. So now that we've got our albedo and our normals, I want to go ahead and start working with our roughness. Because we've got pretty much the surface normals done for what we wanted, we can use that information to plug into our roughness, and that's going to give us some interesting surface interactions with light. I just position our camera here. I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of that. So we're going to get a super wet, super soggy cracker. And I'm going to take our normal map here and I'm going to plug that into our roughness. And from that, I'm going to draw a curvature smooth node. And this is going to give us a lot of surface information. And again, the problem with this is that the whiter areas are going to be rough and the darker areas are going to be glossy. So I just want to use a levels node just to pretty much swap those two. If I come into my environments, let's try and find a different environment here. There we go. And I'm going to use elevator corridor. And so as I play around with this, you can see that as I increase the roughness, I'm going to get less specular reflections here. I want to make sure that we don't ever have a pure white and a pure black. Maybe crunch the blacks in just a little bit. But overall, I'm just focusing on the surface information for the cracker itself, because the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to add a blend node. Whoops. I'm going to add a blend node there. And I'm going to find where we masked off our salt. And I'm going to use this as its own separate entity here. And so you can see that I've immediately created the salt as very rough and the crackers very glossy. And I want to basically invert that. So I'm going to go into our blending mode and I'm going to subtract. And so now the salt is very glossy, very smooth, and the cracker is whatever we've determined underneath. So you can see that as I play around with these levels, it's going to affect the cracker, but it won't affect the salt. So I don't want them to be pure black either. And we can affect overall roughness of our salt just by playing around with the opacity. And I'm going to go about 0.2. And you can see that it's still going to be, actually maybe just a little bit more, 2.35. It's still going to be a lot glossier than the cracker is, but I don't want it to be like a mirror either. So that's looking pretty cool. So I'm happy with my roughness. I'm just going to move this guy down here. Coming down to our metallic, well, nothing on our actual material is metallic, but just for sake of cleaning everything up, I want to make sure that I'm going to plug in a uniform color node. I'm going to switch it to grayscale, and I want to make sure that I set the output size to 16 pixels by 16 pixels so that it's not going to be very resource intensive. And we're just going to keep it as one consistent color. So I'm happy with our metallic there. Our height range as well. Again, you can play around if you're using my template startup. You can play around with the different height range that you're going to get. I normally try and leave this on 1, and then we can just play around with the position as well. Again, leaving that on 0.5. You can play around with the ambient occlusion. Playing around with the different height depth. Now again, you don't want to crank it up because it's going to look really weird like that. It's going to look almost kind of moldy. So I'm going to bring this right back down to maybe about 0.1. Let's maybe try 0.15, just so that we're getting a little bit more shadow information in the recessed areas and the little holes. And then lastly, we've got our opacity, and our opacity we've pretty much already set up, so that looks pretty good. And so overall, I think we're pretty much done the material. So hopefully you made it through this kind of a weird tutorial, but I thought that I wanted to try something new, and let me know how you guys thought. Let me know if it actually is something that you guys want to see, more of those weird flex tutorials, because I got a ton of ideas for just kind of weird and obscure materials. So thanks for watching, guys, and hope to see you in the future.